Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. I have a few things to get started with before we actually begin the presentation. My name is Joy Zabala, and my colleague Diana Carl is who you can see in the other little window. The webinar is beginning now. We are recording. The materials for the webinar, as you can see, are downloadable at the events page related to this particular webinar. You will also see things there following the webinar as well. If you are wanting to use the closed captions, click on the closed captions option in the upper right corner of your Zoom window. The captions will appear along the bottom of your screen. And we have Mary, our captioner, with us today. And Mary, thank you for what you're doing to make this webinar accessible to more people. Also, in order to continue the conversation that we have here, use the text chat. You can open the chat panel from the upper left corner of your Zoom window. Be sure to choose all panelists and attendees from the drop down above the text entry field. That way you can make sure that everybody sees what you're chatting. And also, if you would like to tweet, and you are a tweeter, tweet out at hashtag AEM number 4 ALL. So again, the materials for this webinar is available for download on that page. The link to the recording will be available within a week at the same address. So to begin, the topic today is AIM in the IEP. Where do accessible materials and technologies fit? I'm Joy Zabala, the Director of Technical Assistance at CAST, and we're sort of fondly calling me the Director Emeritus of the AIM Center. Cynthia Curry is now the Director. So with us is Diana Carl. Diana, would you say hello?
Hi, everybody. Glad to have you with us this afternoon. And I'd like to just reiterate that Joy and I are very interactive, and we welcome you to write your questions in the chat window so that we can address things as they come up.
Thank you, Diana. So the main ideas or the major topics for this session are: what are AIM and accessible technologies, looking at the two sides of the accessibility coin, a brief overview of IEPs, and then most of it is where might AIM and accessible materials and technologies be considered or documented in the IEP. So what are accessible materials? Basically, in IDEA, whoops, excuse me, please. In IDEA, there are provisions that require state and local education agencies to ensure that printed textbooks and related core instructional materials are provided to students with print disabilities in specialized formats in a timely manner. That's a lot of words, but basically it's saying if a student cannot make use of print, then that information in print must be provided in a different way, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. Do know that the legal requirement is placed on state and local education agencies. IDEA cannot place requirements on publishers or on developers, so it's up to state and local education agencies to understand what they need to do and then the kinds of steps they need to take to do it. There's a lot of information on the AIM Center website that can be helpful to you if you need more information about those things. So that notion of specialized formats, what are those? There are 4: Braille, large print, audio, and digital text. And exactly the same information is in those specialized formats as the information in the printed materials. The only thing that's different is the presentation of the materials to the user. So obviously, if you're reading Braille, you're reading tactily. If you're reading large print, you're reading in the visually, just like you are with regular print, only you need it bigger. Auditory means that the audible or audio format would be that you are perceiving the information with your ears, you are reading auditorily, and then digital text is the the same information again. And it's not different in any way than the printed book in terms of what's in it, but you have a multiple options. You can see the video and the audio at the same time. You can also make lots of changes in sizes and all of that. But keep in mind that large print and digital text, which is made larger, are not the same thing. Large print is, well, this is print, this paper, and so large print is actually in print, where if you want enlarged text on a screen, what you need is the digital text format. So there was a language change in 2015 that mostly showed up in the request for proposals for what is currently the AIM Center. And footnote 10 says that accessible educational materials means print and technology-based educational materials, including printed and electronic textbooks. So it goes on to say a lot more things about them, but basically the notion here is, as we all know, that it's not okay to provide access to print, but not to provide access to technology-based educational materials, electronic textbooks, the materials that go with them. So as the landscape has changed, although IDEA has not been reauthorized, what the Office of Special Education Programs has done is expanded that definition so that we also have the obligation, of course, to provide technology-based educational materials and electronic textbooks also in formats that are accessible. So there are a couple of other things besides IDEA that has to do with the provision of accessible materials. And two of those are two federal civil rights acts, Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act and Title II of the Americans with Disabilities Act. Both of them prohibit discrimination based on disability. And if you do not have access to the information that is being provided, then obviously you are being discriminated because of a disability. They speak to the obligations of public schools to provide accessible educational materials to students with disabilities who need them. And there's a link there that if you'd like to know more about that, you can find out a good bit more. So Diana, what are accessible materials?
Well, I also wanted to mention that Leslie will put the links in the chat so that you all can get those when we talk about them. Accessible materials are materials that are designed or enhanced in a way that makes them usable by the widest possible range of student variability, regardless of the format, whether it's print, digital, graphical, audio, or video. Content can be what we call born print and require retrofitting. That's just what Joy was talking about with the specialized formats. Or content may be, quote, born digital. That means created in a digital format, but difficult or impossible to retrofit. Going back to try to make something that has been created in a digital environment that without the design for accessibility is almost impossible and very difficult for school districts to do. So what we have thought about and talk about is that content really should be born accessible. Joy, I think you have to move to the next slide for me. Okay, so based on things that Joy was telling you about IDEA, that what IDEA says, the AIM, that it refers to instructional materials in the specialized formats of print materials. Then, as Joy reviewed for you, what's said in 2015, changed the definition to add print, make it print and technology-based materials and technologies. So accessible educational materials means the print and technology-based materials and technologies. But what we say is in general practice, really, AIM is the same as AEM. You'll see both of them referred to very often. This is very technical about what the difference is, but let's move forward with just knowing that they really are in practical use the same thing. The two things that we talk about the two sides of the AIM coin is that on one side, the information is the content. And on the other side, accessible technology is the delivery system that the students or anyone uses to perceive and interact with the content. So we have to look at both sides of the coin when we're considering. Okay. So let's look at what's the definition of accessible technologies. That can be any device, hardware, software, or handheld equipment that provides access to life's activities. It's a much broader definition. It can be used by people with a wide range of abilities and disabilities. And one of the key criteria here about this that's important to remember is that it can be either directly usable without assistive technology or compatible and made usable with assistive technology. I'm sure that many of you who are out in the field and practicing all the time have come across software programs that lock out assistive technology. So those are not accessible technologies. We're looking for those that allow us to make it usable and accessible with the assistive technology.
I'd like to say a little something there, Diana. I think when we think about that directly usable without assistive technology or compatible with assistive technology, one of the things that is critically important that we start talking about and asking for lots and lots is what level of interoperability are there between the materials that are purchased and used by every student and the assistive technology devices that many students or some students may use. So continue.
Yeah, and the key part of that about the two sides of the AIM coin is that both sides have to be accessible in order for the students to be able to perceive the materials. So there's a resource at the bottom of the page, and we'll move on to talk about the definition of assistive technology and services.
My apologies, Diana.
Joy has to move the slides for me. So
maybe we should have worked out a signal or something.
At any rate, I'm sure you all are familiar with the definition of the assistive technology device, that is any item, piece of equipment, or product system that's used to increase, maintain, or improve the functional capabilities of a child with a disability. And of course, these come from the IDEA definition. And then assistive technology service means any service that directly assists a child with a disability in the selection, acquisition, or use of an assistive technology device. And we know there are quite a few services that are listed in the IDEA definition. So let's move to the next slide. And this is another thing that we wanted to highlight, because we hear it an awful lot when we're out at conferences, et cetera, is that there's confusion between what's digital text and what is the digital technology-based materials. So remember that digital text is that specialized format that's created from print-based instructional materials. And digital technology is very different. It's learning materials that are created in a digital environment. And it includes lots of different materials such as e-text, websites, the learning management systems, software programs, apps, and I'm sure you all can probably add more to that list. Joy, I think you're going to tell us about some lessons learned.
Yes, I am. One of the things, of course, and I suspect that many of you know this as well, that the need for accessible materials and technologies is related to function, that function of gaining meaning from the materials that are being used in the educational programs. It's not about a particular disability category. There may be multiple disability categories that impact a student's functional ability to gain information from materials. And when we think about those functions, it's really quite a broad range of functional things. Even though we think of it very much around reading, there are a lot of other functional skills that impact the use of instructional materials. So this is just a list of some of the things that potentially are considered functional skills, some of them related to AIM, some of them not. So a brief overview of IEPs. moving to that part, if anybody has any questions or comments, certainly write them in the chat and Dinah will have a look. What is an IEP? And I suspect that there's nobody on this who doesn't know, but there really are those two parts of an IEP, or two ways you look at an IEP. One is that the IEP as a document, the thing that results from participating in the IEP as a process. So the document describes the services that the student will receive, and the process enables us all to work together to develop that individualized plan that will ensure that the student does get the education that they need. And that document represents the foundation of the child's educational program and serves as the tool or the roadmap to help teachers provide instruction. I think one of the things that's been interesting over my lengthy career in education at this point is how the importance of the confidentiality of the IEP sometimes leads teachers, to think that they can't see them. This is especially an issue sometimes at high schools. And we want to make sure that confidentiality is maintained, but it doesn't mean that it's confidential from the people who are trying to actually implement the program. So within the IEP development, there's a cycle of access and involvement and progress in the general ed curriculum that is available and must be available to every student. So this is that circle, and for me, you're always looking at going up and up and up. And of course, we see that access is just the beginning of involvement. But if you don't have access, it's very difficult to be involved. So each of these is dependent on the other. And how does this connect to AIM and AT? Well, access leads to increased independence. Involvement is certainly like participation, and progress is very much like achievement. So you may see those words back and forth a little bit. Diana, would you want to add anything?
We have a question, but I think we'll finish this segment and then go to that question.
Okay. And speak a little bit about Andrew, Diana. I'm going to pass that one to you.
Yeah, this is a recent Supreme Court case, and recently OSEP did a long webinar on it, and with lots of different presenters giving additional information about it. But it's called Andrew F. versus Douglas County School District, and the decision came down March 22nd of last year. And what the basis of it is based on IDEA. Remember, the IDEA must be reasonably calculated to enable the child to achieve educational benefits. And that's what we've had to work with for many years, ever since IDEA came into being. And previously, the courts were applying a standard that's called merely more than de minimis, which is Latin for like minimal, or minimal. And that was how they considered educational benefits. So you just had to give them merely more than the minimum for it to count as reasonably calculated. But with this Andrew decision, these are new words, and these are quotes from the decision. The IEP must be reasonably calculated to enable a student to make progress appropriate in light of the child's circumstances. And that changes the standard quite a bit. And another part of that decision is that the goals may change, but every child should have the chance to meet the challenging objectives. And so that really changes what the standard is for measuring whether or not a student is achieving educational benefits. So IEP teams are encouraged to look at this further and in deep depth. And we included a link to a question and answer document that really explains the decision in depth. This is on the OSEP website, and you have that link so that you can go in and look at the questions and answers and go into this in greater detail.
Great, thank you. And I think it's a really interesting piece to think about this one because it ups that ante. And I think when we think about the development of the IEP, I believe one of the issues in the Andrew case was that it was basically the same objectives year after year after year after year. And so as we think about all of this, it really does help us or encourage us or make us all work harder together to make sure that we are truly providing a free, appropriate public education.
Which, of course, from our point of view, would be considering well accessible materials when they're needed. So what we're going to talk about next is where accessible materials and technologies might be considered and documented in the IEP. And you're probably all aware that IDEA doesn't specifically tell us where we're supposed to document this and how it should be considered. But one of the...
Oh, sorry. Go ahead. I was wondering if we wanted to address
that question. Yes.
So sure. I think you know the answer to that, and I'm talking to the person who asked the question. That perhaps you could share a little bit in the chat about that. Would closed captions be considered digital text? My off the top of my head would say yes, because it's another way to perceive the same information. The captioner is not adding things nor taking away things from what we say, but simply providing the information in a different format. Whether that format would be considered digital text, I think because it's shown on a computer screen, I believe that it would be considered digital text. If anybody has another idea about that, I'd certainly like to see it in the chat, because I don't know that there's anything that specifically says what is and what isn't. But the fact that it's on a screen, that it is happening at the same time, so you're getting simultaneous information coming to you. It certainly isn't large print or braille or audio. So that would sort of leave that digital text piece. Or
yeah, I think it's really, I'm sorry, I think it's really an interesting question, because you could also consider it as accessible technology. It's providing the access to whatever the video or, whatever is auditory, it's providing the visual channel. And so, it would be debatable probably.
I guess so. So I think, Diana, I'm going to say this and then let you go forth.
Okay.
So why does it matter? And the National Center on Accessible Educational Materials said in some work in 2015 that we're going to talk about it a little bit later, that when AEM and technology are explicitly incorporated into the IEP, the likelihood is increased that the student's use of accessible educational materials will become an effective and integrated part of the learning process, which is what it's all about, in my opinion, and I think in our opinion, and pretty much everyone else's. So tell us a little bit about where you might be able to put these things explicitly in the IEP, Diana.
Okay. Well, as I was mentioning earlier, it's not specifically an idea, but here are the places that we think that it might go very well. And we're going to go through and expand on each of these areas, talking about the evaluation results, the present levels of performance, special factors, annual goals, and this long one with special ed related services, supplementary aids and services, program modifications and supports, as well as statewide assessment, and then post-secondary and transition services. And as we move through, we're going to talk about what are the IDEA requirements, and then how accessible materials and technologies might be considered in that area. And one of the things we'd like to leave you with today too is that although IDEA doesn't require us to put it in specific places, it's really wise if the district or the state or whomever does address this and do it in a consistent way so that people across the district or the school or whatever your circumstances might be are doing things in a consistent way, and they have clarity about what might be expected. So you can put some prompts if you have forms in so that these areas are considered as you move along. So let's look about evaluations, because people come to the IEP meeting with all their collection of past evaluation information. And the requirements and the idea say that we have to assess the students in all areas of suspected disability, use a variety of assessment tools and strategies, and obtain information to assist in developing the content of the IEP. So where AIM and technology might come into play is looking at, is the printed text or the digital media a barrier for the student? Are they having difficulty with it? Does the student need accessible educational materials? Does the student need AT to access the specialized formats or the digital materials? Remember that the two sides of the coin, with the other side being what's needed so that the student can access those materials. So let's look at an example, and we're going to take Sean, who's a 7th grade student, and we're going to use him as we work through these different areas to talk about examples. He's previously been identified as having a learning disability, but according to the most recent evaluation data, Sean is able to understand grade level content, but he's unable to independently derive meaning from print and technology-based materials. These data suggest that Sean needs further evaluation to determine the specific formats and the features needed to support this learning. And then after some further evaluation, we move to the next section, and this is the results of the further evaluation, which indicate that to participate in progress in the general ed curriculum, Sean requires a digital text format of printed materials and assistive technology that enables him to see and hear the content at the same time for audio-supported reading. Digital learning materials will be needed to be accessible and to allow the use of text-to-speech tools. Joy, do you want to comment about the audio-supported reading?
Sure. On the AIM Center website, if you search for audio-supported reading, there's lots and lots of excellent information that was primarily developed by Dr. Richard Jackson, who is on the AIM team and also is a professor at Boston College. He happens to be a person with both a visual and auditory impairment. And so he talks about having the audio-supported reading and what that does to his own ability to read and his level of fluency. It's really quite interesting stuff. And it's one of those things that I think for a long time we've known somewhat that it's a really good idea for people who have difficulty with decoding, like Sean apparently does. That providing both the auditory and the visual pieces simultaneously can really be very, very helpful in not only providing access to the information, but also is, in many cases, a tool that actually supports reading that isn't audio supported. So one of the things I think that's interesting about this part when we look at evaluation, and it talks about further evaluation indicates that, and on, is that, remember, this is part of the IEP team. So the evaluator is not making the decision. The evaluator is providing the information that enables the IEP team to make the decision. Also, as we go forward, which we will in just a second, keep in mind that you may not write this in all of the places we're talking about. So be aware that there are a lot of examples here that you might choose among, or it put in some short way into the IEP, but we want to give you as rich examples as we can. So thank you, Diana. Continue on.
Okay, let's talk about the present levels of academic achievement and functional performance. You know that's required by IDEA to describe these present levels and describe how the student's disability affects his or her involvement and progress in the general curriculum. So what we're looking at and considering is the student able to access and derive meaning from print-based instructional materials? And is the student currently using AIM and assistive technology to access the general education curriculum? This is one of the areas where it's really important to be very specific, because you build a lot of the IEP goals off of this. And so be sure to explain if they are using AIM and AT, exactly what they're doing, and talk about what their strengths and weaknesses are, because it's really important to include all of that in this area as you move through. This would be an area where they really do need to all address it, probably. So let's look at an example. Again, a present levels of statement for Sean is that he's a 6th grade student who has a learning disability. He understands instructional content at grade level, but independently reads printed material at the 4th grade level. So using a tablet computer with audio supported reading software, he successfully perceives and interacts with digital text formats of grade level textbooks and printed materials across the content areas. So that's quite a difference in what he's able to do.
I think, too, this is one of the places where we've not done it in this particular example, but when you're talking about present levels, you know, we learn a lot about not putting a brand name, but rather putting the kinds of features that are needed in tools and in materials. However, in present levels, there is some thought, and I go with that thought myself, that we really should put in actually what the person is using. That maybe he's using an iPad, or maybe he's using some other tablet. Maybe he's using a particular kind of software that he's comfortable with already. The key reason for this is that if we're going to change those things to something else, we really need to be aware that there's going to be a learning curve, and there will be a dip before there's a rise. So it gives us an opportunity to say, can we use the same things? Are they still right for the new goals and objectives he's going to address? Or do we have them available, or should we get them for him? There's a lot that can be thought about based on what he's using in the present levels. If any of you have used word prediction, you know that read and write goals, text to speech word prediction is wonderful, and that Solo's word prediction is wonderful, and there are many other tools. But what you also know is they don't work in exactly the same way. So you may be talking about the same feature, but something totally different. I can give you a great example. We've had 2 trials with this particular webinar tool, and it's new to us, and so we bumpered around quite a bit trying to get there. And you'll notice several times I've moved the slides when I didn't need to, because it looks a little different. Well, certainly we hope to pay attention to the content, but what happens is that you do get distracted as a person who's using the equipment, in the equipment being different. And so that's what we do when we change what a student is doing with what their tools are in their present levels of performance. Not saying don't change them or don't consider changing them, but it's always good to start with here at this point with knowing what you actually may be changing or deciding not to change for a student.
And I'll again reiterate about being specific, because it'll be really important to be specific about what they're using, what the features are, and how they're using it in order to make those decisions that Joy was talking about. So let's move on and look at the next area where you might consider AIM and accessible technology, and that's in the special factors. And I imagine everybody's familiar with the 5 special factors that are in IDEA that need to be considered in the development and revision of every IEP. And that includes the behavior supports, the language supports for limited English proficiency, the Braille instruction, communication, and the AT devices and/or services, of course, which is prominent to us. But we're also expanding this, since we're talking about accessible materials, that you need to really look at about whether or not the student needs instruction in Braille, and also would like to expand upon some of the thoughts that we may have previously had about the communication special factor. It says that you must consider the communication issues of all students, and it's not just for those who are hard of hearing or hearing impaired. So, but in the case of those who are hard of hearing or hearing impaired, then there are further things that you need to do. But what we haven't been considering in the past is that communication is both written and can be oral. And so therefore we need to look at the accessibility of all communication as a part of considering accessible, whether or not they need accessible educational materials or technologies. So let's look at the considerations. I think I've already spoken to each one of those. And then in the next slide, we have the example of the special factor statement that this is kind of reiterating things we've already said about Sean. He understands educational content at grade level, but is unable to read with sufficient accuracy and fluency to support comprehension at that level. Sean needs materials provided in a digital format to access the general curriculum. And as Joy was saying before, these are somewhat repeating the same things, but this is an example of what you could say at this place about the student. So it goes on to say that Sean needs a tablet and or other computer with text-to-speech and word prediction capabilities in order to perceive and interact with the digital text format of grade level textbooks and other printed materials used across the content areas. So did you want to expand any about the example there, Joy?
Nope, I think it's fine. I think, yeah, here's the place where you, again, might either continue on with what a student is using in the present levels, or you might make a change. So based on, as you do with all the other special factors, what does the student need in order to work toward mastery of their goals? So.
Right. Okay, so then we want to bring to your attention a joint Dear Colleague letter. And this was a communication that was jointly with the Department of Ed and the Department of Justice. And in this communication, which Leslie will put the link in the chat window for you, it talks about that both IDEA and 504 guarantee the student's right to a free, appropriate public education. And then Title II of ADA mandates effective communication. There's an analysis that you apply that a student with a disability must have communication that's as effective as communication with students without a disability. And we make the point here about the communication includes visually, orally, and motorically presented communication. So that's something we need to make sure that we're considering all parts of this. Okay. So one thing that you might do is that you could put a specific prompt in your form, such as, does the student have a disability that prevents effective use of standard educational materials? And then they would address that issue and put it in the IEP. If yes, does the student require specialized formats of printed materials and or accessibility options in digital materials? Well, we've heard from many districts and school districts that in state agencies that they are including the consideration of assistive technology and accessible technologies in as a sixth special factor. So that's something you might mull over a little bit and consider how that might work, because we do want those prompts there. Joy, would you review for us about annual goals?
Sure. The key, as you know, is that the requirements are to state the measurable annual goals, and both academic goals and functional goals, also curricular and extracurricular, and then to describe how those goals will be met because of the student's disability-related needs, so that the student can be involved and make progress in the general curriculum. And so when we think about AIM and tech considerations here, you need to have those goals in place, and then you think, for which of these goals will accessible educational materials and or technology be needed to support achievement of these goals so that the student can make progress in the general curriculum. So there's sort of a couple of ways that this might happen. I have a strong prejudice toward one way, and my colleague, who is an attorney, has a strong preference another way. So I'll tell you a little bit about this maybe. This is where the technology is written into the goal. By May of 2015, when using digital text formats, actually we could bump him up a few years, couldn't we, at this point? We don't know if he did that or not. When using digital text formats of social studies materials in delivery technology, Sean, our guy we've been following all along, will identify examples of sequential, comparative, and causal presentations of information in text with 80% accuracy. Now, what we know already from what we've heard about Sean is that if he has the appropriate materials, that digital text format on his tablet, he can do grade level work. And this is a grade level IEP goal that's absolutely related to almost every curriculum in some way. It may or may not be what you may or may not be using the Common Core, but you're using something very close to it. So these are the kinds of things that a student at grade level, the grade level Sean is functioning in right now, is it could be expected that he would do those things, but he needs to have his materials in order to make that happen. The other thing that, and I will say a little bit more about this, if a student needs accessible materials across the entire curriculum or most of the curriculum, and also perhaps needs technology, possibly assistive technology related to reading, possibly other, what I think is a bit kludgy as a teacher is that if you state the goal, state the materials, or state the format in every single goal, you do an awful lot of repetition. And I would rather see, and it certainly goes along with universal design for learning, that rather than putting the means within the goal, that you write the goals and then you provide some sort of paragraph or something that says, for these goals, this student needs to have whatever those technologies and formats are available to them. So that's my bent as a teacher. My friend who's an attorney said, no, I like it like this because I want it to be very clear when he's got to have this material. I just feel like it's a little difficult to say every single time when using digital formats of whatever materials. He needs them for all materials. So looking at that, just a thought. So then we get to the long one: special education related services, supplementary aids and services, program modifications and supports. The requirement here is that we look at what the services and the aids and the modifications and the supports that will help the student advance toward their annual goals, be involved in and make progress with the general curriculum, and be educated with students with and without disabilities. Then the tech considerations, or the AIM considerations, are, okay, in what ways can AIM help the student be involved and make progress in the general curriculum? Is AIM needed as part of special education or a related service? Now, what that means is it doesn't say, is it delivered as special education or a related service or a supplementary aids and service? It says, is it needed as a part of the child's special education, supplementary aids and services, and related services? I think those are backwards, but that's basically the three things. And meaning, I think, by that if you have speech language services for a particular child is receiving speech language services, but needs an augmentative communication device in order to participate and benefit from those services, then that device is a part of that student's related service. So that's an interesting piece to think about. That came to me from a colleague not too long ago that said something about, well, what about that as a part of thing? And it really did make a difference in how I began to think and talk about it. And just last week, I had a call from somebody saying, in our district, we deliver all assistive technology services and related service. And I was like, but that's not individual case by case. And it's not necessarily a part, it doesn't go with that a part of idea. It's not how we deliver it globally, but what is it that the student needs AIM for? What is it that the student needs AT for? Just some things to think about. And then, of course, we want to think about what training related to AIM or technology will be needed for the student, the educators, and the family. And some of those things that we think about supports for use of AIM and AT include technology and training, instructional strategies, support services, and other accommodations and modifications that may be important. Like, I know that often if a student's using audio supported reading, they have to have a fairly quiet place to read because they're using audio support. If they're writing with text to speech, they may need a quiet place to do that. So it may be something related to preferential seating for some situations. That doesn't mean in another room, that doesn't mean back in the corner, but ways that we have to think about that happening. And so we would put this into action, and we think about Sean again. We're going to talk about the supports and services that he needs. He's going to use that tablet computer or other devices and it tells what it's for, that provides simultaneous visual and auditory output to support his perception of and interaction with digital text formats of grade level printed materials across the content areas. And that he's going to receive training on how to use that digital format and technology for participation and achievement. So it's not just here it is, go for it. He's actually getting support in how to use his materials and technology well, which of course makes sense. And then again, when we think not just about what sort of support and training Sean needs, but what about his teachers? They will receive training to support his use of materials and technologies. Doesn't mean they have to know everything he's going to do, but they have to know how to support him. And it does mention that other piece. He will require headphones and preferential seating in a quiet room of the in a quiet area of the classroom when he is reading with text to speech. So, statewide assessments and AIM and technology, let's look at what it says there. The requirements include a statement of the appropriate assessment accommodations, if any, and if the team determines that the student needs to take an alternate assessment, then they have to state why the student cannot take the regular assessment and why the particular alternative is appropriate for the student. So when we think about technology, what assessments and accommodations are needed for a student who uses AIM? And how do these accommodations relate to the AIM and assistive technology that the student is using in the classroom? This is a huge area with lots and lots of, we could do a whole hour or day or week on this particular issue because it is very iffy. Many times what a student is using in the classroom is not allowable on the assessments. So then we have to think, all right, if they can't use this particular thing on this assessment, what accommodations can they use that will provide support for them so that they can actually show what they know and are able to do? So in Sean's case, we want to make sure that consistent with the accommodations that he's using in the classroom, which is really good. That means good things are happening with Sean. He will receive the following accommodations on the assessment. He will have read aloud, but it doesn't just say read aloud. It talks about what it is. Simultaneous visual and auditory access to text through independent use. So we're not talking about somebody reading to him. Independent use of text to speech on all allowable parts of the assessment. Of course, we all know that we roll our eyes at the allowable parts, but it's real and we do the best we can and also work toward change. And then he is going to scribe, but again, in an independent way, not dictating to a scribe, but text input through independent use of word prediction software on all allowable parts of the assessment. And I will tell you that there's a lot of discussion and a lot of forward movement in at least the conversation moving along quite well about really looking at how classroom use and assessment fit together.
Joy, I mentioned this is a great example of what you were talking about before, that we were moving to a different system today and trying to use it and bumpering around with it. That's exactly what happens to the students when they're using something in the classroom and then they give them different tools to use on the assessment.
Right. That's exactly right. And it was funny this morning when we were failing our trial. I have an Apple Watch that tells what my heartbeat is, and I didn't have it on. And I told my husband later, it's probably a good thing. It would have probably disturbed me, the level of my heart rate while that was going on. And what if I was doing something that meant I would or would not meet the proficiency that I needed to show what I know. So yeah, very important and very high stakes. And then we come to transition. So in transition, including post-secondary goals and transition including post-secondary goals and transition services in the IEP are important to develop a summary of performance, which is really an important piece, very similar to the present levels, but much more in depth, looking at the student's academic achievement and functional performance and recommending how their post-secondary goals might be addressed. So when we think about AIM and text, again, how do we help the student? And this is something that we should have been thinking about since Sean was in the first grade or before. How can we help the student develop those self-determination skills that they need in order to advocate for themselves and their own need in relation to accessible educational materials? This is what I need. This is why I need it. And this is how I know how to get it, or how do I get help when I need it? So, and then how can we help the student plan for his or her need for AIM and related technologies in the new environments, which of course requires conversation and discussion between both the sending environment and the receiving environment, or the potential receiving environments for the student.
Joy, I'd like to add here
that
the public schools have an obligation to determine what services the student might need. But when they go to post-secondary environments, that's not the case. And that's why the self-determination skills are so really important, that we build those all along, like you said, from an early age.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Continue. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, that's fine. It's just that they may be using accessible materials and assistive technology very competently, but then if they move to the new environment, those skills may not transfer unless they are able to advocate for what they need.
Right, exactly. And I've heard some very skillful self-advocates talk to disability services at some very well-known universities, and they say, oh no, this is what we provide. And if the student is not able to say, wait a minute, that doesn't meet my needs, and this is why, then that student probably is going to have a lot of backsliding in their post-secondary education or their workforce. Important stuff. So putting this into action, Sean's home state begins transition planning at the age of 14. However, in his school district, building self-determination skills begins earlier. Again, Sean, he won the jackpot in several ways. The future transition planning might include goals such as he will advocate on his own behalf, determining when he needs to use a specific, a specific specialized format and what technology works for him best in different contexts, because it may not be always the same format or the same technology in a variety of contexts. And then the second one is Sean will build the skills needed to advocate for himself in post-secondary environments by leading discussions during IEP development. As Diana said so well, the push system of K-12 education is a very different place than the pull system of post-secondary education, workforce development, adult services. So if a student does not have the opportunity all the way along to learn more about how to advocate for themselves, specifically related to not only these issues, but others, we really are not doing everything we should be doing for them as their teachers. So, Diana, you want to talk about leveraging resources really quickly?
Sure. Okay, well, this is a visual of the AIM Center website, and there are tons of resources here. And one of the things I would encourage you to do, anything that you're looking for, a little search window up there. It's a very robust search engine on this website, and you can just put something in that search and find things you're looking for, like things that we were mentioning today. Different links are there. So, Joy, would you move to the next one, please? This is a series of videos that we did that you'll find, the link is there. This particular student, her name is Una, and she's a wonderful example about transition services and self-determination. They started at an early age with her, and she is a powerful person advocating for her own needs. She has pretty significant visual problems, and she uses Braille. She uses all the specialized formats, really. And we divided the videos so that they were shorter and in different segments. And I think you'll find a lot. If you're doing, somebody in the chat mentioned that they were going to be doing professional development, you might look at some of these videos here because they're powerful when you're presenting, to give a little example of somebody using things successfully.
Great. Thank you, Diane. And there's also another student in that same area called Bailey. And Bailey has autism, but he also has a print disability. And again, in both Una and Bailey's stories, there are, as Diana said, there's little snippets. Sometimes it's the student talking. Sometimes it's their teacher talking about what changed over time. Sometimes it's a parent. So they're really a beautifully rich set of potential materials to use, and quite compelling. So we've come to back to that same quote that we said earlier, and now hopefully we all have a sense of where you might put, which seems to be pretty much everywhere, that you might put AIM and technology explicitly into the IEP. Because we all want to foster the likelihood that a student's use of AIM, which is actually the only reason why we acquire it at all, for students to use it, will become an effective and integrated part of the learning process. You'll see at the bottom a link that takes you to, and Leslie, I'm sorry, I don't know the piece that you put in the chat, but I bet you'll find it. This has recently been an updated white paper that goes through very much the same process as we've covered in this webinar that you might want to put together. Diana and I and our colleague Joanne Carger, who is a PhD attorney, a PhD in special ed attorney. She's got a lot going on. Have a look at that, and you can also use that anytime you want. That would be helpful to you.
Joy, I noticed in the comments that Kristen is saying that she used Bailey with her undergrad students and they loved it, gave them a whole new perspective. So that's
it really does. Great. And the great thing about Bailey's whole situation is that when you think about the need for AIM being related to function rather than to disability category, you'll often see, well, that doesn't mean people with autism. But Bailey has such a strong accompanying print disability that for him, it's rather remarkable what happens for him. And to listen to his mother talk about who he was and who he is pretty special. So with that said, thank you. We hope that you will.
Wait just a second.
I'm sorry.
We have another question.
Oh, sure.
Okay. From Dawn, where in the IUP would you put teachers required training? My daughter has a hard time getting large print consistently from her high school teachers. They're not organized and prepared.
You have a couple of, and this is just me talking, but you have a couple of issues. I think one of those places, Dawn, would be in that when we talked about the support for staff and families, that the training that goes along for everybody in that section that had, special education related services, all of those things listed, that would be a place where it would be determined and written into the IEP who would receive some training on this. The other place is that organization-wise, you might talk with an administrator about the possibility of bringing people together and having a bit of awareness training of what difference it makes for her. Diana, did you want to add anything there?
I would add to that because she said she's having a hard time getting it consistently. Mm-hmm. A lot of the places that we talked about, like if you already know that she needs it from past evaluations, or you put it there, you'd put it in the special factors, present levels, to describe what she needs. There are just all these different places that it can be included in the IEP or written as an accommodation, So it would be not only good to get the training for the teachers, but also to include it. In different ways. Yeah. So I guess we're up.
That's good. No, that was because I hit the mouse. Dawn, the other thing too would be to go to, if you need further assistance, in every state there is an AIM coordinator, and you can go to the AIM Center site and find AIM in your state, a section called AIM in your state, and that you could call that person and ask for assistance. So I hope that would help you too. So we're come to the end of our hour. Thank you for spending this time with us. Please do take a moment to complete the webinar evaluation. Leslie has, I think, already put it in the chat. And if you downloaded the slides, you see it here. If you don't do it right this second, please do it soon. Otherwise, you will forget. And it does make a difference because it helps us improve what we do. I'm not sure what that is, but oh, thank you for joining us, Joy and Diana. And also there are our email addresses. And then also you can connect with the AIM Center through its website at aim.cas.org. You can also email us at aim@cas.org. We also have a phone number. You can follow us on Twitter, on Facebook, and we're just right here. So don't hesitate to call upon the AIM Center anytime. And it was my pleasure to be here. Thank you for being here with us.